For 25 years, Brightview Senior Living Associates have been committed to creating a vibrant culture and delivering exceptional services, making Brightview a great place to work and live. If you're looking for a rewarding opportunity to serve your local community and grow, we want you to join our team. Brightview Senior Living is growing and actively seeking vibrant associates to join our community teams, including directors, healthcare, activities, hospitality, and dining. Apply today at careers.brightviewseniorliving.com. Equal employment opportunities. Text BV Jobs to 97211 to apply.
A rich life isn't a straight line to a destination on the horizon. Sometimes it takes an unexpected turn with detours, new possibilities, and even another passenger or three. And with 100 years of navigating ups and downs, you can count on Edward Jones to help guide you through it all. Because life is a winding path made rich by the people you walk it with. Let's find your rich together. Edward Jones, member SIPC.
Welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. I'm joined today by Alexander Larman, who has written a new biography of David Bowie, Lazarus. And it is obviously, when this goes out, it's going to go out. This is recorded here on the 3rd of December. It's going out much closer to the sad anniversary of Bowie's passing. Which is in 2026, will mark 10 years since David Bowie passed away. And it's going to be obviously a time in which conversations about Bowie and his legacy will no doubt be at the forefront of many people's thoughts. But firstly, Alexander, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you today, and thanks so much.
Pleasure to be here.
Okay. So, to begin with, obviously the field of like kind of Bowie studies is very broad. If you go to any sort of Waterstones, you'll find, and look in the music section, you'll find a huge chunk of stuff about the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, probably the punk era. But kind of Bowieology is quite a thing, isn't it? How was it navigating this, not only this vast legacy, musical legacy and cultural legacy of David Bowie, but obviously this huge canon of work about him? So that's a challenge.
Oh, it's a massive challenge, because obviously what you face with Bowie is the fact that people feel very proprietorial about him. And I think that what's very interesting is that because he had so many different personae, because he was somebody who kept shape-shifting, in a sense, everybody has their own version of David Bowie. I mean, he once said that I am only the person who, as many people believe that I can be. And I think that what was always interesting for me is I've always wanted to write about him. I've always wanted to tackle Bowie. But it was finding the right approach, because there have been so many, if you will, cradle-to-grave biographies, especially after he died, that I thought, well, I don't have anything to say, especially about the 70s and 80s era, which was before I was born. I mean, I was born in 1981, so it was just the year after he released the Scary Monsters album. And so I was always very interested in writing about Bowie, but I always thought there's no point writing a book about David Bowie that isn't adding something significant to what we know and
Yeah.
understand about him. And another difficulty that we have is that there's a vast Bowie archive. I mean, it's at the V&A East in London, but it's also an archive where there's a huge amount of information, but it doesn't say nearly as much as you think it's going to, because
Yeah.
essentially, as ever with Bowie, it's a lot of detail. But the central question that I always wanted to get to, and I think anyone writing about Bowie wants to tackle this question, is who was David Bowie? And so what I thought was interesting was looking at the area of his life which has always been rather underexplored, and that was the second half of
Yeah.
the life and career. Because obviously we know, well, we think we know about the 70s, we think we know about the Let's Dance era, we think we know about, Bowie's unlikely rise to fame and prominence. But it gets to 1989, where he's done the Tin Machine project, which is a failure. I mean, let's call a spade a spade. It did not work, and it was not something that he was ever going to be remembered for. And so we see the idea of Bowie, this man who was once always two steps ahead of the game, always the person who was in charge of a situation. We see him flailing. We see that he is actually behind the curve now. We see him desperately trying to catch up. We see him trying the old tricks, and the old tricks aren't working anymore.
Mm.
So to me, that was the way into his character as much as it was into his music, because there's a real sense, and I hope I try to get this in the book, that for quite a long time, well, probably I'd say up to the year 2000 when he headlined Glastonbury, that there was an uncertainty about Bowie, and that the 90s, I mean, he did some magnificent work in the 90s. I think that the albums Buddha of Suburbia and Outside in particular are as good as anything he ever recorded. But there's also a real sense with Bowie that he was flailing and he didn't quite know what he stood for anymore. Because
Yeah.
certainly when I was growing up, I mean, I always quite liked Bowie, but I wouldn't have said I was a massive fan of his till I was probably about 18 or 19, because up to that point, I just thought of him essentially as a singles artist who, since the heyday, was recording work that somebody a bit like a Sting or a Phil Collins might have done.
Yeah.
And what was so interesting for me is properly researching all this. It was, first of all, it's reassessing everything he did, because it's been 10 years since Bowie died, and we now have to look at all the albums together, if you like, because you look at what he was doing in the late 60s, we look at his last album, Blackstar, and they now stand as the unarguable canon. We look at the canon of David Bowie, and we have to say, well, this album's better than that album, and this album's more enduring than that album, sure. But we also have to ask, what was going on in his life when he was recording it? I mean, what was leading him to do this? And I think that the answer has to be, it was a very long sense, this very long tail of where he was trying to catch up, where he was trying to reassert his dominance, and because he was trying to be other people, didn't work. And then when he comes around and he becomes himself again, then he starts to succeed. Then he begins to understand that actually, I am this person who is unique. I am always going to be David Bowie, and I need to, if you will, fall into my David Bowie-ness to make it succeed. And to me, this is a very interesting story. It's not just an interesting story about music or about society. It's an interesting story about a man, because I've written several biographies before, and to me, the question that you always begin with is, who is this person?
Yeah.
And in Bowie's case, that's a lot harder for me to answer than it would be about, say, the Duke of Windsor or Lord Rochester or Lord Byron, because all those people, I think you can make a judgment on them, and my judgment might be different to somebody else's judgment. But I think it's a judgment that you can back up with posterity. Whereas obviously, I mean, 10 years since his death is not a long time.
No.
So this is I mean, this is the first book I've written, which is essentially, it's not quite current affairs, but it's not far off. And obviously, the good thing is there are people around who played with Bowie, who worked with Bowie, who you can talk to. And of course, one of the absolute highlights of doing a book like this is that you get to spend time with these people, because it's a real privilege to be able to sit down with a man like, say, Mike Garson or Reeves Gabrels, who's this massively underrated figure, Bowie's artistic genius, and to really talk to them about what was Bowie like, because you're not doing something in the promotional sphere anymore. You're not doing something to promote an album. You're taking a step back after years and years and years, and these people are but very kindly in every case, giving me their time and their thoughts
Right.
about what it was like to be in the orbit of this remarkable man. And what I was so relieved to hear was that Bowie was a very decent person, because obviously he is an absolute idol of mine. I mean, my daughter has Bowie as her middle name. We are talking that level of adulation. And I think that if I'd found out he was a complete shit, that I'd be really disappointed, and I'd be thinking, that's not what I wanted to hear.
I found in recent years the kind of the number of heartbreaking realizations about former musical heroes has led me to almost adopt the policy of don't ask, don't tell. The kind of where you think, oh my God, yeah, yet another kind of musical hero turns out to have been a terrible human being. Yeah, but so I'm relieved to hear that about David. I really am.
Yeah, I mean, but then conversely, I mean, what's been interesting is that early readers of my book have said to me, "You're quite hard on him. The first, third or so of the book,
Hmm.
he is not coming across very well."
Yeah.
And I think that is in large part because you are dealing with this period that he was in decline, and most people, when they know they're in decline, are not at their best. But what I was absolutely desperate not to do was to write a
Hmm.
hagiography of him, because
Yeah.
ultimately nobody's interested. And I
No.
don't think there's ever been. I mean, look, I'm sure that the Bowie estate would be interested. But then actually, I mean, I must just say that the Bowie estate have never cooperated with any biography, and I don't think that they ever will. But what's interesting is that I found relatively early on that the interviewees I approached fell into line quite fast. And that often they would say, oh, if you want to talk about this, talk to so and so.
Right.
And given that it would have been clear to the Bowie estate relatively early on that there is somebody sniffing around doing a new book, I suspect that the word would have gone out quite early on. We don't want you to talk to this person. So,
Yeah.
I mean, the book is not authorized. It's not even, half authorized, but I suspect that obstacles would have been placed in its creation that haven't been if
Hmm.
there was a sense that I was writing something that they didn't want to get out there. Because, I mean, the Bowie machine is a very, I mean, as it is for any artist of a similar level of fame and success, it is a machine that depends on its continued existence, on that figure not being so tarred by association. Because you're completely right. I mean, let's give an example. I mean, Morrissey, for instance,
Yes.
he has been so tarred by association over the last few years that actually it's dreadful, because I have friends who say they can't listen to the Smiths anymore. And I think, but of course you can listen to the Smiths. The Smiths are brilliant, but they can't, because they can no longer separate Morrissey, the singer of the Smiths, from Morrissey, the person he is today. Now, you see, I think that's a pity, but that's a much more pervasive view than I
Mm.
would have expected. And so it's interesting because Bowie, obviously, he got a lot wrong, both personally and artistically. And what's been interesting is that people often bring up his drug crazed remarks in the 70s about fascism and how Britain needs a strong leader. And of course, at this time of international instability, and where certainly I think, it's fair to say that right wing, even fascist views have had a greater hold over the mainstream than they have in decades, Bowie is again being cited as a right wing rock star. Now, you see, it's interesting because we look at the idea of a right wing rock star, we look at somebody like, say, Eric Clapton,
Yeah.
or and it's interesting because Bowie, he, he never exactly refuted what he said so much as saying, oh, yeah, I was just stupid, I was on drugs, blah, blah, blah.
Mm.
And it's interesting because if we try and dig into the real David Bowie, it gets harder and harder and harder, because there isn't a real sense from the music, certainly, or even from the interviews, of what he believed. Because you've really got to read between the lines, and actually, that's where. I mean, I think he's a great lyricist, but I think he's often been underrated as a lyricist because of that cut-up style he would do,
Yeah.
whereby it would often come across as quite intentionally nonsensical. But then you think to yourself, well, if somebody like, say, Burroughs or E.A. Cummings was doing something like that, they wouldn't be called they might have been called nonsensical. But I think it has to be looked at in terms of this. I mean, one thing I find particularly interesting, actually, and having just reread the book, what I hadn't actually twigged when you're writing something, even while you're editing it, is how fascinated Bowie was by the sense of a godless world. That essentially, from
Mm.
the new millennium, from the idea of 9/11, it became dominant feature in his writing, the idea that we are all alone in this godless universe, that the deity has abandoned us and that we are stuck. And Nietzsche was right, God is dead, what's left? And of course, that to me, he could have just been putting it all on, but there is a remarkable consistency about that,
Yeah.
which I don't think you necessarily see that if you just listen to one of the albums individually or if you just look at a couple of interviews. But actually, if you put it all together, then there is a consistency of that. And I certainly think that, I mean, he would often talk about how he was depressed or unhappy in interviews. And of course, every interview for David Bowie was a form of performance art. He
Yeah.
would sit down and he would act. And it was one very interesting thing you pick up on when you're reading all the interviews back to back, is that he wouldn't really talk to the person. He would charm them. They would sit there and he would expound on what he wanted to talk about. And then at the end, right, thank you for that. And they would have assumed they would have got some amazing revelation out of Bowie that nobody else has ever come close to, because Bowie would offer this appearance of friendliness, this appearance that, in fact, the interviewer was the only person who really understood him. Then they'd go away and write their piece up, which was usually, I mean, not always, but usually quite adulatory. And then you would turn around and you'd say, oh, he said the same thing to everyone else that day.
Yeah.
But of course, did that mean he didn't believe what he was saying? No. I think he always believed what he was saying in the moment he said it.
Mm.
And I think, because, I mean, what's so interesting about Bowie is that we have to look at the idea of...
It's third down. Did you see the game last night? Of course you did, because you used Instacart to do your grocery restock. Plus, you got snacks for the game, all without missing a single play. And that's on multitasking. So we're not saying that Instacart is a hack for game day, but it might be the ultimate play this football season. Enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 orders. Service fees apply. For 3 orders in 14 days. Excludes restaurants. Instacart. We're here.
A PSA from Instacart. It's Sunday, 5 p.m. You had a non-stop weekend. You're running on empty. And so is your fridge. You're in the trenches of the Sunday scaries. You don't have it in you to go to the store, but this is your reminder. You don't have to. You can get everything you need delivered through Instacart so that you can get what you really need. More time to do whatever you want. Instacart. For one less Sunday scary, we're here.
For 25 years, Brightview Senior Living Associates have been committed to creating a vibrant culture and delivering exceptional services, making Brightview a great place to work and live. If you're looking for a rewarding opportunity to serve your local community and grow, we want you to join our team. Brightview Senior Living is growing and actively seeking vibrant associates to join our community teams, including directors, healthcare, activities, hospitality, and dining. Apply today at careers.brightviewseniorliving.com. Equal employment opportunities. Text BV Jobs to 97211 to apply.
Of the parts he was playing and the sincerity that he exhibited. Because if you remember a few years ago, when Bruce Springsteen was doing his show on Broadway, and he was standing up and saying, the Bruce Springsteen blue-collar rocker is as much a creation as Ziggy Stardust. This was met with quite a lot of surprise. But then you think to yourself, but why should we assume that any musician, whether it's Bowie, Springsteen, or anyone else, has to be this? I mean, I suppose someone like Billy Bragg might argue that he is a sincere figure. But the whole artifice of being a musician means that you are putting on an act. I mean, just as an actor goes on stage wearing makeup and, saying somebody else's lines, so a musician is doing something which is surely based around this idea of performance in its true sense. And Bowie just understood the idea of what it was to perform better than anyone else.
And this is perhaps in his thinking where you get these different iterations of Bowie. And you have a moment in the late 1960s where he's a more trying to present himself as a kind of a folk singer, and that doesn't really work. And then he tries various things. I mean, he's a mod slightly before that. And then when glam comes along, and there are these debates around Bowie and glam, whether he was actually glam or, and you can wind up in a kind of glam internet forum bar fight, basically, about what is and what isn't glam. But his skill and perhaps his luck was interpreting and capturing not just that moment in the early 1970s, but a kind of, I think, a collection, a constellation of ideas around gender, identity, sexuality, science fiction, fame, and a bunch of other stuff. And you hear this a lot from kind of quite now in their probably in their 50s and 60s, quite prominent gay writers, artists, people like Neil Tennant in the Pet Shop Boys, Alan Cumming, who say that moment in 72 on Top of the Pops with Starman was the moment they said, yeah, well, that's me. And that has never been represented. And it was as to us now, I mean, what it was he puts his arm around Mick Ronson. And for us now, looking at that in 2025, this is the most kind of innocuous thing. But in 1972, that obviously was something very, very suggestive, and the fact that obviously he's not dressed like a heterosexual man, and you know he made these pronouncements about bisexuality and then retracted from them later on, which again comes back to your point about Bowie saying things when he says them and meaning slightly different things later on. But he seems to have had, and again, this maps into your thesis, Alexander. These moments of being able to kind of capture particular moments successfully, and then he can't, you know, and then he loses that.
Yeah, because one thing actually that you bring up, it's a very, very good point, is that I don't really deal with sexuality in the book because he said in every single interview given throughout that period, I was never really bisexual. It was a thing I said to attract publicity, which I could well believe. So in a sense, all these people who are making these grandiose claims for Bowie as somebody who was queer, who was some sort of bisexual pioneer, I think they'd be disappointed. But on the other hand, you're absolutely right, because, yeah, you're right. 1972, Bowie's standing up on stage and he's put his arm around Mick Ronson. It's only 5 years since the legalization of homosexuality. So you do see that he is doing something daring, because certainly, I mean, it was not the case that you had other people going on Top of the Pops in the early 70s and making that kind of very homoerotic gesture. I mean, you look at the Beatles, you look at the Stones, you look at the Kings, you look at all the big acts of the 60s. They're very, very straight. And then you have Bowie, coming along. And even if he himself is not actually bisexual, even if his pronouncements on this are clearly designed to shock and to titillate rather than because they're actually true, they're still having the effect, aren't they? Because obviously the Ziggy Stardust character is so bound up with the idea of being bisexual and being all things to all men at the same time. But then you look at he's drawing on Oscar Wilde, isn't he? He's drawing on Jean Genet. I mean, he wrote a song about the Jean Genie.
Yeah.
You can see that what Bowie has done is he's gone away with his big old library and he's been reading his big old library and he's synthesized the ideas and the themes and the statements into a way which is immediately accessible and hopefully going to cut through to the mainstream. I mean, it's not for nothing. He began his career in advertising, and that taught him the way in which you have to convey an often quite complicated idea with great economy and in a very memorable fashion. So I think that one of the things about Bowie's, if you will, journey throughout the 1970s is that it was a very, very fast journey through an awful lot of styles, identities, sexualities, gender bending, confusion, and so forth. And then, boom, wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. You end up in 1983 with Let's Dance, which is such an atypical album for Bowie.
Yeah.
But of course, it became his biggest hit.
Yeah.
And that's the way in which, I find the Let's Dance album fascinating because it's a great album. I mean, it's fantastic, but it's nothing like anything he was doing up to that point.
No.
But of course, young Americans had nothing to do with Ziggy Stardust.
Yeah.
And then constant sense of Bowie. I mean, then, you end up with Blackstar, which I think is an absolute masterpiece. And it's very interesting because when that album came out, I was worried it was being overhyped because there was so much about the last album of Bowie, the Last Testament, and so forth. You've got to have a few years to really appreciate how good it is.
Mm.
And I think now you listen to it and you think, yeah, you were really on form when you were writing and recording that, which is ironic because he was dying of terminal cancer. But there's I mean, that's the thing. It's for 2016. There was that album. There was the Nick Cave album about his son, Skeleton Tree, and there's the Leonard Cohen last album, You Want It Darker. And those three albums, to me, are so imbued with mortality and so imbued with the idea of death that you listen to them now, and they're all quite hard to listen to in their own way.
Mm.
But the Bowie album's the one, and they're all extraordinary. But the Bowie album's the one that I think I get something new out of it every time I listen to it. And that has to be something that you can say about so many of his other albums as well, because there's some, I mean, some of his albums are dreadful. I mean, I wouldn't try and pretend otherwise. I mean, for instance, the first Tin Machine album is terrible. The Earthling album, the drum and bass album, is terrible. And people will defend these albums, and they're allowed to defend these albums. But I listened to everything that he recorded while I was writing the book, and it was very funny because you listen to some albums, you think this is terrific, this is really overlooked, this is really underrated. And you listen to other albums, you think, oh, for God's sake, what were you doing here? And what I hope I've done is I hope I've put the bad albums in the same context as the good albums, because obviously, just as nobody sets out to make a bad film, nobody sets out to record a bad album. But things go wrong. I think what often went wrong for Bowie was a sense that he didn't really know his own mind.
On the subject of bad films, I mean, there's a whole other book to be written there about David's oeuvre. I mean, he's been in some films I enjoyed. Himself, I never found to be a convincing actor particularly. But I mean, some films such as Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence, I just kind of liked anyway. It's very kind of deeply.
Third down.
Did you see the game last night? Of course you did, because you used Instacart to do your grocery restock. Plus, you got snacks for the game, all without missing a single play. And that's on multitasking. So we're not saying that Instacart is a hack for game day, but it might be the ultimate play this football season. Enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 orders. Service fees apply. For 3 orders in 14 days. Excludes restaurants. Instacart. We're here.
Kind of visceral and moving film. But he himself had I mean, was not really kind of, I don't think really particularly designed for the screen. But what are your thoughts there?
Well, it's interesting because I did cheat very, very slightly in the chronology of the book, because the book is supposed to begin in 1989, but I do include the film of Last Temptation of Christ, which obviously was slightly, I think it's 88 that was done. So a slight cheat, but only a very slight cheat, because I think that if you don't have his performance as Pontius Pilate, which is fantastic, then you are lacking. Because essentially for me, there's 3 great performances during the period that I'm writing about. There's Pontius Pilate in the Scorsese Last Temptation of Christ. There's his Andy Warhol in the Basquiat film Basquiat, directed by Julian Schnabel. Then his last significant performance is as Tesla in the Christopher Nolan.
Christopher Nolan's.
Yeah. So you've got those 3 great performances. You've also got a very, very funny cameo in Zoolander. And you've got other cameos in TV and stuff like that. But it's difficult because as a film actor, he was more significant in the previous period. So, I mean, I think that if you were going to talk about Bowie as an actor, the cracked actor himself, you'd want to talk about Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. You'd want to talk about The Man Who Fell to Earth, his most iconic performance. You'd also want to talk about things like Baal, and of course, you have to talk about Labyrinth. So you're absolutely right. And I mean, it's interesting because if people like this book, I have other ideas as to what I want to do about Bowie next. I mean, the only thing I wouldn't want to do is, I think, a conventional biography of a certain period, because I feel that the further back you go, the harder it is to find people who, I mean, for instance, you'd want to speak to Mick Ronson, but the only way you can do that is with a Ouija board. So you'd always have to you'd have to be looking for a new angle. But I think the thing about Bowie is that there will be 100 more books about him in the next 10 or 20 years. There is never going to be such a thing as a definitive Bowie biography. And of course, as I was saying earlier, we now have the V&A East, we have the Bowie archive, which is available for scholars, for fans, for everyone. And you'll be able to provide an awful, because actually what was funny is writing the book, I finished it and I handed it in at the beginning of 2025. And I, I was always saying to the V&A, can I come and see what's in the archive? And they said, well, no, you can't. That's not because we're being difficult. It's because we genuinely don't know what we've got. So by the time that the V&A East opened, the Bowie Centre there opened in September, it was still only about half catalogued. So you've got the displays and you've got there's some really fascinating things which are actually stuck in a so-called bonus track at the end of the book. But it's not going to be until about a year after my book comes out that you're really going to have a full sense of everything that he did. And of course, you've got so much there. You've got all these unrealized projects. You've got all these notes on how albums developed. And I think anyone who is a Bowie nerd, and I'm definitely a Bowie nerd, is going to get so much out of it. But then on the other hand, is it going to actually affect the stories that we've been hearing about him? I don't think it is, because I think that the basic narrative is never going to change. And so, yeah, I mean, ultimately, what we have with Bowie is we have an awful lot of information and an awful lot of differing opinions about him. And I think that's healthy. I think that what makes Bowie so exciting for me is that there is no such thing as a definitive David Bowie any more than there's going to be a definitive David Bowie biography. We will always have this figure who is he is kaleidoscopic. He is somebody who shifts according to what perspective you take. I mean, he was somebody who, I mean, people often talk about not quite recognizing him. There being a sense that he would walk into a room as one person and walk out the room as somebody else.
Yeah.
And the question is, were you seeing David Jones? Were you seeing David Bowie? Or were you seeing somebody else? Were you seeing Ziggy Stardust or the Thin White Duke or somebody else?
And
I guess,
I was going to say, it's that mercurial nature that means that he is, to all of us, ever so slightly unknowable.
Yeah. And I think that that's what we've always wanted in our pop stars, isn't it? Or our rock stars. We've always wanted these figures who are out of our usual depth, out of our usual standing.
But it was a great book, and it's by the guy that used to edit Mojo, I think, about the rise and fall of the rock star. And a lot of it, where he talked about the unknowability of the rock star and the fact that everyone from Elvis to Little Richard to Elton John to David Bowie to Axl Rose to whoever it is, we think we want to pin them down, but we actually really don't. We want them to be that kind of larger than life character, but that have that kind of elusive element to them, because that's what represents fantasy, you know. And, you know,
and of course,
even fantasy,
and even the word fan that obviously stems from that as well. But it's interestingly so that because obviously we have I suppose probably the turn of the millennium around the time of the Bowie comeback. You began to have this completely new wave of pop and rock stars. You know, people like, say, Chris Martin of Coldplay, or Fran Healy of Travis, or the band Keane. And their appeal, as far as I could see, and of course this continues to Ed Sheeran these days, seems to be based on their being as normal and down to earth and everyday as possible. And that's really interesting as a flip side, because there's a good story about how Chris Martin tried to write a song for David Bowie, which was going to have a thin white Duke character singing it. And apparently Bowie called him and said, "Wasn't one of your best, was it, guys?" Which says everything you need to know. But I think that is it. And I think that you're right, that we have moved towards an era now where you still have people like Charlie XCX, who obviously very much they are personae, they're going on stage and they are channeling Bowie in their own way. But as the era of the male rock star is probably in decline, and certainly the idea of the guitar band is massively in decline, we look to the idea that we are abandoning that sense of these people being avatars of our own fantasies and our own desires. We are looking much more towards the idea that we want something accessible and approachable. And Bowie was neither accessible nor approachable. He was entirely his own person. And I think that's what makes him so interesting, and which is why he's going to endure.
Oh, final thought I want to end on. There's a photo, and it kind of endures in my imagination, of the wedding of Bob Geldof and Paula Yates. You may have seen the picture. Yeah. And you see in Bob Geldof and Paula Yates in the foreground, and then there are the great luminaries of 1980s British pop in the background. I think there's Sting, I think there's most of Duran Duran are there. But in the right at the front of the picture, Bowie is essentially on a throne. He's there, he's sat down, and your eyes are drawn to him as this kind of this king almost within the image. And when you look at who was in the background, Simon Le Bon, Sting, all of his imitators, the sound, the new romantics, and the kind of the sound of 1982 to 1986, 87 was there, and they must have. I'm sure, in fact, I know, but most of them grew up wanting to be him, just as he grew up. He and John Lennon and the previous generation had grown up wanting to be Elvis. And for me, one of his greatest achievements wasn't just his music, but it was his ability to define an entire generation of other musicians, how they sounded and how they looked. You listen to like ABC or something like that. They almost tried to nick his act, you know.
Not as badly as Gary Newman did.
No. Less than that, the better. Right. So, Lazarus is out. Is it January 26th?
January 26th. It's officially published on the 1st of January, but obviously it's going to be the 8th of January. That's the anniversary, which is where things get very exciting. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, I will hold this podcast back to around that time.
Fantastic.
We will put something on the website. Big reminder to everybody, as we always say at the end of each episode, please buy this book from either a independent retailer or from directly from the publisher. If you can do, the big online retailers have enough money already. The little guys need your help. Thank you so much, Alexander. It's been a wonderful chat today, and I'd love to talk about Bowie again. I, like you, am a Bowie nerd, and it's an inexhaustible supply of kind of exploration about our kind of shared social and cultural history. I'm absolutely sure of that.
No, I could have talked about him all day. One of these days I probably will.
Okay. Thank you so much, and very best of luck with the book. Take good care now. All the best.
Thank you. Good.
What does it mean to live a rich life? It means brave first leaps, tearful goodbyes, and everything in between. With over 100 years' experience navigating the ups and downs of the market and of life, your Edward Jones financial advisor will be there to help you move ahead with confidence. Because with all you've done to find your rich, we'll do all we can to help you keep enjoying it. Edward Jones, member SIPC.
For 25 years, Brightview Senior Living Associates have been committed to creating a vibrant culture and delivering exceptional services, making Brightview a great place to work and live. If you're looking for a rewarding opportunity to serve your local community and grow, we want you to join our team. Brightview Senior Living is growing and actively seeking vibrant associates to join our community teams, including directors, healthcare, activities, hospitality, and dining. Apply today at careers.brightviewseniorliving.com. Equal employment opportunities. Text BV Jobs to 97211 to apply.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.